It is time to dive into the menu. And so in this part of the class, this is where the PDF that comes with the class will be of help, because I have the entire menu laid out on two simple pages, all the tabs, all the items in order. And the first two pages of this, as I say, go through the entire menu system. And these have my recommendations that I will be giving here in the class. Now, the two pages after this are ones that do not have recommendations, because I know you're going to have your own settings that you do for this camera, and this allows you a chance to either have a clean menu or something where you write your own notes in there. And so this might come in handy for this section of the class. Now, as far as the menu goes, this is actually exciting stuff for me. Okay, maybe I have a sad life, but no, this is where when I get a new camera and I'm going to make a class and I want to know what the camera does, I go to the menu system and I just go through every item in the menu and I want to see what it does, what new things are in there. And Canon's put a lot of new things into this camera, so there's going to be a lot to talk about in here. But this is where all of the operations reside. It's also where you might see some duplicate items that we've already talked about before, whether it's in the quick menu or whether there's a direct button that does that. And that's just allowing you to have it in the menu to get if you want from there, but you can also attribute it to a button on the camera in many cases. We'll talk about a lot of customization as we dive into the menu. So let's go ahead and talk about the menu here a little bit more. In general, to start with, you hit the menu button, and that's going to give you access to these multiple tabs of information. Canon's done a pretty good job organizing information into these different tabs, and so we'll have a different section for each of these different tabs in the class. Now, to navigate, you can use the joystick on the back of the camera. You can also page left to right using the main dial of the camera, also that front dial there. If you use the mode dial, that's going to tab left and right. And you can also hit the Q button to tab to the right, and then you can go up and down with the back wheel of the camera. And you can, of course, use the touch screen if your fingers are small enough to fit there. Sometimes mine are a little bit big. Some people like the touch screen, some people don't, so you have options. You can go either way with this. Now, be reminded that there are kind of two different modes to this camera. There's the shooting mode and the movie shooting mode. And there are two different menus between them. And so to switch between the two, of course, you hit the mode and the info button to go from stills to movie. And then when you hit the menu switch, it's going to look different in some, but not all of the areas. It's a little confusing. I wish that Canon just had a movie menu that you could get to at any time, but you have to be in the movie mode to get to the movie menu. So I've decided to break up the first main tab into two videos for this class. The first one will deal with still photography in the shooting menu, and then the next video after this one will be for movie shooting, and it'll be going through the entire menu. There's a lot of items that are exactly the same, and that means that it allows you to have one setting for stills and one setting for video, even though you see them in there twice. Now, be aware that the camera is highly limited when you are in the scene intelligent modes, whether that be for stills or for video. So you want to be in a mode like manual or aperture value, time value. It's one of the more manual modes, not the scene intelligent mode, because then you won't have access to all the tabs and all the features. As we look at the menu, I'm going to show you the feature, and sometimes there'll be a JPEG only sign that comes up, and that's to let you know when you shoot RAW that feature will have no impact on your RAW image. And there's a lot of things that you can do to manipulate JPEG images, so that's a big topic in this first section. And so just be aware that if you are a RAW shooter, there's going to be a bunch of things that can be set in the camera, but they really don't matter in the final result of your RAW image. They may matter, though, in the way that you see the image in the viewfinder and on the back screen of the camera. And this can be an advantage, for instance, in shooting black and white photography. You get to see through the viewfinder what it looks like in black and white, but your raw image is in the original raw color information that you can adjust with later. As I say, I'll be giving you some options in here as for recommendations on the settings. And I found that it's hard to just have one recommendation for everything. And I know there's different levels of users. And so I will have a general recommendation for most people as a good starting point. but some of the more advanced users typically like having a more manual control on certain features. And so I'll put those recommendations in red so that you can kind of make a choice between which one is right for you. As we go through the menu, you might notice that some items are dimmed out or maybe not even there at all. If they are dimmed out, hit the info button and that will give you more information about why you're not able to set that. Generally what happens is that there's a conflicting setting somewhere else in the menu, and it's been a problem on previous Canon cameras and lots of other brands as well. You go to access a particular feature and it just won't let you do it, and you don't know why you can't do it. Canon's done a very good job at letting you know why you are not able to turn something on, so you can go jump to something else, turn it on, turn it off, so that you can come back and access that feature. As you go through the menu items, you'll see that some items are in blue and some items are in white, and that's just letting you know whether they're selected or not. And something important to know is that at the bottom of many screens is going to be instructions and helpful information about further setting. There's a lot of submenus buried within submenus. They get to be a little bit of a rabbit hole in some areas. And so sometimes you need to pay attention, because that info button will actually allow you to enter into another level of that particular mode. And we'll do that from time to time in demonstrations, so I'll show you all about that. All right, we're finally ready to begin the first tab and the first menu item, which is image quality, and we've already talked about this back in section 2 on camera basics, but let's just review real quickly. In here is where you're going to set either RAW or JPEG, and along the top you'll have the listing of what you have set and how many images you have left on the card, so you can see how many images are left, and that's nice to know. Now, one of the things we did talk a little bit about was RAW versus compact RAW, and I told you at the time that compact RAW is great and it's what I would use. And so let me show you an example. And so what I've done is gone through my little standard test, and I'm going to magnify this quite a bit in size. And what I did is I took a picture of a RAW, which is about a 47 megapixel, or excuse me, a 45 megabyte file, versus a compact RAW, which is only 21. So it's less than half the amount of data in size. And while I could see some differences and I could see some things that were different from one image to the other, I couldn't really pick one as being better than the other. And so, as I say, I normally want to go for the highest quality image possible, but when you're paying double the price and you're not getting anything visibly more, I'm kind of wondering, is it worth it? So I've done some research on the internet and see what other photographers say. I haven't seen anybody that's really proven to me conclusively that a full RAW is better. I heard some talk that, well, if you're going to push the shadows, you want the full RAW because there's more information there. I says, okay, well, let's run another test. Let's underextop by 4 stops, overexpose by 4 stops, which is pretty extreme. Try to fix that in post-production and see what looks better between the two. And once again, I couldn't see the difference. Now, I did run this test at ISO 100, and I have done some informal tests at higher ISOs, and I still haven't seen any significant difference. And so if you have questions on this, you might want to try a test yourself. If you want to trust me, I believe that if you shoot compact RAW, you're going to do just fine on virtually everything imaginable. There might be some special use cases with particular ISO settings and particular apertures where it does make a difference, but it looks like that compact RAW is doing a fantastic job. All right, so I'm recommending compact RAW for all you serious shooters. I know there's from time to time a reason to shoot JPEG. If you are, you probably want to be shooting in the large size JPEG. All right, next up is dual pixel RAW, and this is where the camera has each of the pixels kind of recording light on both sides of the pixels and can kind of double those pixels, and it's not a 90 megapixel camera, don't make that mistake. It's still 45 megapixels, but it has additional information and it can do some, well, I would call it some very interesting tricks. And so let's take a look at a few of those tricks. All right, the first thing that we can do here is called image micro adjustment. And what this is you can adjust your focus after the fact ever so slightly. And maybe I should stress that a little bit more. ever so slightly, you can make this adjustment. So using, I believe I have the 85 1.2 lens, I focused in on the wrong eye on purpose. So the back eye is what I focused on. And you can go into the Canon software, load up the dual pixel raw image, and you can switch back and forth from standard to front. And while I can see a subtle, very, very slight difference in focus, I was not able to fix the problem of focusing on the back eye rather than the front eye. And so it was not able to fix this situation. It did move the sharpest point of focus, as I say, ever so slightly, but I can't imagine shooting a double-size file just to get that effect. Okay, something else that I think is very interesting is the bokeh shift. All right, so we have an image and you take it through the Canon software and you can have the bokeh in the back shift back and forth. We're going to shift left and we'll shift right, and we can go back and forth between these two images, and that's very interesting. I don't know how useful it is, but it's very interesting. So, interesting, Canon. All right, one more thing it can do is called ghosting reduction. All right, it's turned off. We can turn it on. We can turn it off. It looks kind of different. That's kind of interesting too. I'm not sure if I need that, but it's interesting. Now, it can do a couple of other things that I haven't talked about that we'll talk about when we get to the playback menu. It can also do portrait relighting, where it essentially lightens up the face. It has a facial recognition and can lighten up the face, which is something that I do in portrait photography from time to time. So that's a little bit more valuable. And the fact that I can do it in camera, I guess, makes it handy for some people, but it's something I would have more control over in post-production software. You can also change the background clarity so that if you're taking a portrait and the background is out of focus, you can make it more in focus. There are some situations where that might be handy, I suppose. So all of these things I think are very interesting. They're clever, they're unique. I would never use any of them, but that's just me. It's personal choice. I don't think they're really all that useful. And the problem with shooting in the dual pixel RAW is that there's a lot of things that won't work on the camera when you're in that mode. And it pretty much doubles the file size again from a standard RAW. That's not even a compact. So it's about 4 times the size from a compact RAW. And you can do some of these interesting tricks that if you can find something clever, that helpful, that's awesome. But generally, I would not shoot in this mode regularly. It's just a waste of space unless you're particularly going to use those features. All right, enough of that. All right, next up, cropping aspect ratio. And so this is where you can use something less than the full aspect ratio of the sensor. Normally, your sensor is on a full capture, which means a 3:2 aspect ratio. If you want to shoot in a crop frame, you can. You will get less pixels. The main reason for doing this is that if you know what the output is of your final image and you want to only record that and you want to be able to see it in the frame of the camera, this will show you. Now, if you are shooting RAW, it will show you some lines as to where to crop, but it won't actually crop. If you use Canon's Digital Photo Professional software, it can then apply the crop to those RAW images. So this is kind of only applying to JPEGs, but it will still work with RAWs in the sense that it'll help you frame up your subject correctly. All right, page 2 in the shooting menu, exposure compensation and auto exposure bracketing. This one I want to do a little hands-on and show you a little bit about this, just because we've got a couple of different things going on in here. So let's dive over to page 2, exposure compensation. So by turning the back dial, that is doing exposure compensation. So if we wanted to do a manual bracket, for instance, we could shoot a minus, let's see, what mode are we in? We're in aperture value. We're going to dial down and set a 2-stop underexposure. We'll do our normal exposure. And then we'll do our +2 exposure. And you'll notice that I have to get it set where I want it and hit the set button in the middle. And as I play back, there's our +2, our normal, and our -2. Now, if you wanted to have it done automatically for you, you can turn the top dial, and now I can do the same thing by pressing the OK button in here, and we're going to shoot 1, 2, 3, and hopefully that got us through our +2, our -2, and our normal, which is the same thing we did here, but it was just a lot quicker. And so we want to go back in and get this turned off because we don't want to leave it on in that mode. That's a sure way of misfiring. Now, the other thing that you can do is that you can set up a bracket of any size you want here. Currently it's set to 3. We'll be able to adjust this later on. And you can shoot a whole bracket series that's either under or overexposed. And so it's extremely versatile, and it's quite easy to see what you're doing there. Just make sure that when you're done, you press the set button so that you lock in those settings that you want to have in there. All right, next up is our ISO speed settings. We talked about this earlier as far as your standard settings from 100 to 51,000. We do have the high setting up to 100,000 and a low setting of 50 that we can set as well. So this is what you would probably normally do with one of the buttons on the outside of the camera. You wouldn't normally come in here and dive in here to do it, but it can be done. Now there are some more controls over this here. You can control the speed range. This is the range that you can select manually in the camera, and I'm not sure why you wouldn't want to have the full range available. If you were going to hand the camera to somebody who didn't know what they were doing, yes, you might put some limiters and say, I don't want you to use the high setting, so I'm not going to allow it. But for people who know what they're doing, and if you've taken this class, you're going to know what you're doing. I would want the full range available. I want to go all the way down to 50 maybe. If I need it, I want it available so I don't have to come in here to the menu to unset it and make it available. So set the widest range possible here makes the most sense to me. Now the auto range is the range when you choose the auto ISO mode, what range does it go between? And we all have certain standards, and this is where you can employ your standards. Generally, it's probably pretty smart to have 100 on the low end because that's going to be where you get the least amount of noise and the greatest amount of dynamic range. The maximum end, well, you may want to do a little bit of your tests. You may want to take a look at the ISO tests I showed you earlier in the class to see what's the maximum ISO you want to use when you have auto ISO selected. 6400 still does a very good job in this camera, in my opinion. 12,800 might be good enough for a lot of purposes, so you might need to take a look at that to make your own settings there. Now the minimum shutter speed is really important when we're talking about the auto range because the camera will jump up to another higher ISO level when the shutter speed gets too low. So let me kind of explain with this scenario. We are in aperture priority, we will say. We'll be at 5.6. It doesn't really matter which number, but just to put a number to it. And the camera is going to be setting the shutter speed for us, okay, according to where the light is. Now, if we're using auto ISO, the camera has both shutter speeds and ISOs in which to work with. Now, for a given amount of light, we'll say that the camera wants to use a 60th of a second, okay, at ISO 100, fine shooting situation. Now, if the sun gets brighter, we're going to use faster shutter speeds to accommodate for the extra brightness, all right? Now, when it gets darker again, the camera's going to use lower shutter speeds, but there's a certain shutter speed that it's going to make the switch over to the ISO in order to make that change. If we have 1/30th of a second set as our minimum shutter speed, the camera is going to go over to ISO and make adjustments should it get even darker. Now, as the brightness comes back up, it's going to try to lower the ISO back down to 100, and then it will adjust with the shutter speeds again. And so the key thing you need to think about is when you're using auto ISO, what types of things are you photographing and what sort of shutter speeds do you need? And so we have the option of setting this manually to a particular number, or we can set it automatically. And it's very clever about this because the camera will automatically look at what focal length lens is mounted to the camera, or where your zoom lens is set, and it will set a reciprocal of where you're shooting at. So if you have a 35mm lens, it will set about a 1/30th of a second, which in many cases is a reasonable hand-holding shutter speed. Now this does not take into account people or things that you're photographing that may be moving around. This is just your movement as a photographer holding a camera. If you are a travel photographer and you're working out kind of on the darkened streets and you're able to hold the camera quite steady because you have the stabilization of the camera and the lens may be working for you, and you want to be a stop slower than standard, or 2 stops or 3 stops slower, you can select that in here. Now, if you're photographing people, like you're a wedding or event photographer and people are constantly moving, you can say, well, whatever lens I have, I want to be 1 stop, 2 stops, or 3 stops faster. So let me show you on the camera right here, and we will make a few of these adjustments and talk about this a little bit more. All right, so we're going to talk about our ISO speed settings. We come down here to minimum shutter speed. If we want to set a particular manual shutter speed, like you know that you need a particular shutter speed, maybe you're shooting sports and you need 500 or 1,000th of a second, or you're shooting portraits and you want 1/250th or 1/25, or you're shooting handheld and you know you can get down to 1/8th of a second, you could set that here. But if you want to set the auto, we can have the auto and you can have it just looking at the lens. And so my lens right now is set to about 50mm. So it's going to choose around a 1/60th of a second. If I'm very good at hand holding the camera, I might be able to do it down at a 1/30th, a 15th, or an 1/8th of a second. And if I'm shooting faster subjects all the time, I might be over on the plus side. So I think the auto setting is going to work really well for a lot of people out there. And then if you want to make that little tweak that kind of customize it to your needs, that would be a good tweak to add in there. All right, HDR PQ, perceptual quantization. And so this is dealing with hooking the camera up and getting the HEIF files out of it and hooking our camera up to an HDR TV so that we can have an image that goes directly from here onto a big old TV, and it's got HDR styled photographs that have the color and the tonal range mapped for that type of system. Now, if you want to shoot in the HEIF format that we talked about that has a little bit greater tonal range, you need to come in here and turn this feature on. Otherwise, you'll be getting JPEG settings. And so that's the key to getting HEIF. And as I mentioned at the time of the recording of this class, it's not really a full-on thing that all the companies are using in the software. And so we'll see where it goes. It looks like it's a better system than JPEG. That, I think, is not really in doubt. It's just whether it's widely accepted and easily usable. All right, so the first thing you can do if you do want to shoot in the HEIF format is to turn this on. From there, there'll be a few options about the display. So when you are shooting, do you want the exposures to kind of bring you more information in the midtones or in the highlights? And that's just going to be up to you and depending on what you're shooting, what's most valuable for you. Now, when you play the images back, and especially if you're going to hook them up to a large monitor and do a slideshow, for instance, what's more important in showing, the midtones or the highlights? Once again, very personal as to what you are choosing to do there. So that's kind of the key to shooting in the HEIF images is you got to come over here, set this on, and then you can go back to page 1 where you have your image quality settings. All right, the auto lightening optimizer. This is for JPEG images only, not going to have any effect on the raw images. What this does is it tries to lighten up the shadows and limits the highlights from going too bright. Take a look at the histogram, and you can see where the highlights are in comparison to the right side of that histogram as well as the shadows are. And you'll see that as we move over to the high settings, it's lightening up those shadows and it's holding back those highlights from getting too bright. All right, next up is highlight tone priority, and this is looking at the highlight area and trying to holding back the highlights. And the way it does this is it limits the ISOs that you can shoot at. So you can no longer shoot at ISO 100 when you turn this on, which is a major downside of doing this. I guess the idea is if you are shooting in JPEGs, you don't mind shooting at 200 and 400, which is perfectly fine for the most part. This will protect those highlights so that they don't get blown out. And it's something you may want to test to see if it's worth if you're doing JPEG shooting. For a lot of users, it's just not something that's going to be valuable for most purposes. All right, anti-flicker shooting. Now this can really save your butt in some situations. There was a situation where I was working with another photographer in a gymnastics arena. It wasn't a professional, it was more kind of a workout team place. And they had a big auditorium and they had big high ceilings and they had some unusual funky lights. And this is my first time being in there. And she was asking why she wasn't getting consistent results from her camera. And I was looking at it and I took a look at the ISO and the shutter speed and the aperture. And the images were all very consistent, but the brightness was different between one image and the next. And then I figured out it was the lighting in there. And the problem is that under certain types of light, it flickers. And so these fluorescent lights, they go up and down in brightness over a short period of time. And so if you're shooting at 12 frames a second, that picture you're shooting might be lucky enough to be at the top of that brightness peak or at the bottom, and it's likely to go up and down and cause you a nightmare when it comes to looking at all of your images and finding out that they're all inconsistent in their brightness. So the camera has a flicker detection system, and it can determine at what rate the light is flickering, and it can time the shots to the peak of the brightness so that you get the maximum brightness and that they're consistent. And the camera can do a very good job at this. The only downside is that it may not be able to shoot at that 12 frames a second. It might be 11 or 10 or 9, but it's still going to be quite fast, and it's going to save you the trouble of having to try to fix those images later on. Now, I ran across a similar situation with this light, which is in a bicycle tunnel, and as I took images with manual exposure, you can see the difference between these 4 images in brightness. There is a notable jump in brightness between them. So I turned on the flicker reduction system, anti-flicker shooting, and while the images are not absolutely exactly the same exposure, they are extremely close and more than close enough for my needs and for my convenience. And so if you encounter this situation, I highly recommend using it. But I don't recommend just leaving it turned on. It can cause a conflict with a few other settings in the camera, and it can slow down the motor drive if you're just outdoors shooting sports all the time. So don't use it unless you need to, but it is a very important tool to remember for solving those types of situations. All right, we have maybe the biggest rabbit hole in the camera here of menus, in the menu system, in that it goes into a lot of different items. And this is for dealing with an external speed light. So a lot of this doesn't apply to just shooting with the camera unless you have a light attached to it. You can turn it on and off. Normally you would do it on the flash itself, but the flash might be mounted in an unusual location. So this allows you to do it straight in the camera. The way that the camera works with the light in TTL shooting for the through the lens metering system, what happens is the flash fires a couple of flashes, the camera reads it, determines how far the subject is, how bright the subject is, and does a very good job. So you can leave this in standard most of the time, but if you switch this over to ambient priority or flash priority, it's kind of playing around with the ratio of ambient light to flashlight, and you may want to play with that a little bit to see if you get a look that fits your needs a little bit more. All right, the metering system on it, it uses this eTTL metering system. It's very good. The Evaluative system, it works just fine, but they've now added face priority onto it, so it will recognize faces and it will further adjust the exposure when it sees the face. And this is probably going to improve the TTL response on the camera a little bit if you do a lot of people photography. If you're not shooting people, then you might turn this back to evaluative. Continuous flash control, and so this is going to determine whether the flash is doing the eTTL on each shot or just the first shot. You might get a little bit faster continuous shooting if you have it set to first shot. So it depends a little bit on how you're doing your photography, but you'll get a little bit more accuracy if you have this set to each shot. The slow synchro will allow you to shoot at slow shutter speeds, which can be really nice under low light conditions. And so we have a few different options here. You can just select an auto range, and if you're comfortable hand holding the camera with slow shutter speeds, this is going to be a good option. You can also lock it into a faster, more easily hand holdable range, or to a high shutter speed. Now be aware that the mechanical shutter speed, and you remember we have mechanical, electronic, and electronic first shutter curtain options. If you have it set to mechanical, the top shutter speed with flash is 1/200th of a second. If it's in the electronic first shutter curtain, it's 1/250th. So be aware if you're switching between those two or using flash a lot with them. All right, so flash function settings allow you to change the flash settings using your camera's controls. Once again, you would normally just go up to the flash and change it because it's usually right there on top of the camera, and they have controls that are dedicated for it that you probably get to learn over time. But that flash might be in a housing, it might be located off camera where it's a little bit different position and not as easy to get to. It allows you to get in here and do it yourself from here. And the same thing is true of the flash custom functions. There's a number of custom functions that you can also control on the camera. In this case, you do it through the camera itself. All right, on to page 3, white balance. Well, we've talked a lot about this before. Auto white balance is going to do good most of the time. You can adjust it as need be. Now, the auto white balance does have a white priority option where if you want to allow in just a little bit of that ambient light, you would leave it in the auto white balance. If you really want to get it perfectly color corrected, you could put it in the W option for the white priority, and that would be good as if you were trying to get the most extreme color accuracy possible. One of the great items that you can use in here, if you're not totally sure as to what the correct white balance is for a situation, is to photograph a white subject, and then come here to the custom white balance setting in the menu and select that image on the card, and then go back to the white balance system and select custom. And so this can be really useful when you're in a situation where you might have mixed lighting. You might have natural light coming in through a window, and you might have some fluorescent or tungsten light inside, and where you're photographing kind of has this weird mix that nothing works perfectly and you haven't been able to figure out on your own. So let me show you how you would do this. And so what we're going to need is something white, and I'm going to use the back of my PDF to photograph. So let's go ahead and fire up the camera. And rather than photographing our prop box here, I am going to just hold up a white sheet of paper. Not exactly the most exciting photograph, but what we're going to do is we're going to come in and go to page 3 to custom white balance. And you'll see there's different photos that we've been taking here. And I'm going to take this photo of a white sheet of paper, and we're going to press the set button to lock it in on this. And we're going to say OK. And so the custom white balance has been set for this studio, but my white balance is currently still on auto white balance. And if I want it set for the studio, I'm going to come over here to this custom setting right there, and we'll take a look, and we look like we have pretty clean, nice whites there. And so that was how you set it for a particular environment. And so the key thing to remember is that you set the custom white balance for a particular area, and then you go back to white balance and set white balance to custom white balance so that you're actually looking and using that custom white balance as your standard. All right, white balance shift and bracketing. I hope you do not need to use this. This is for JPEG only. If you needed to get images straight out of camera and you weren't sure about the white balance, you could do a bracket system here. You could also just shift the white balance a little bit if you need to. I don't think most people are going to need this, except for some unusual cases where you're trying to overcome a particular color in a scene. But normally, make sure this is on 0 most of the time. Color space. This is the range of colors that the camera is recording in. When you shoot in RAW, you are shooting in the Adobe RGB color space. When you shoot JPEG, the camera comes set to sRGB, and sRGB is a smaller color space that's a little bit easier to replicate It's the way pretty much everything is on the internet. And so if you're only going to be posting images on the internet and that's all you're going to do, sRGB is going to work perfectly fine. If you're thinking that you want to edit your images, if you want to print with them, if you want to work with them in post-production, then you're probably going to want to shoot in Adobe RGB so that you have a larger color gamut. Next up is picture styles. And so in this case, it is determining the menu style and the picture look of the photographs that you take. Does not affect your raw images, except in one little case. So this is really only important for people who are shooting JPEGs. Where I like to use this is when I'm shooting black and white images. When you set it to black and white, you get to see black and white in the viewfinder. You get to see black and white on the back of the camera. Now the differences might be hard to see on screen here for you. If you shoot it in person, you might be able to see the subtle differences between these. It's the contrast, the color, the saturation, and so forth. Most of the time, I would leave this in the standard setting. The reason I wouldn't use the auto setting is because then it could drift and shift from one image to the next in a situation. So I prefer standard in most cases. But if you do want to tweak with this, if you are shooting JPEGs and you need to get the right looking JPEGs out of the camera and you want to adjust them, you can come in here and adjust them. So let's go ahead and play around with this a little bit. So we'll fire up the old menu system and we'll come on down to picture styles. And let's just say we want to modify the standard setting. You see down at the bottom it says Info Detail Set. So if we press Info, we can come down here and we can take the strength and we can increase the strength of the sharpening in this. And these are all different characteristics of how the sharpening is being done, how much is being done, what type of edge detail it's looking for, where it's going to be done on the image. We can increase the contrast, deal with the saturation, and as well as changing the color tone. So these are things you normally are not going to need to do, but they can be kind of helpful. For instance, if you want to come down here to user-defined settings. And so I've come in here in some cases and then hit the info, and rather than doing standard, I would come down and select monochrome because I like to shoot black and white from time to time. And I do like to have this a little bit more edgy in contrasting, so I'm going to bump all these up one, and then I'm going to bump the contrast up a bunch. And I'm not going to worry about the filter effect, but you can come in here and have some fun when you're shooting the right colors. We're not going to worry about a toning effect here. And so when I have it set to this user defined, I'm going to hit menu to exit out of this. And so that's currently selected. So you can see my camera is now in kind of a very contrasty black and white mode. And that's also what you would see in the viewfinder. And so as you change your exposure, it's very nice to be able to see that. I'm going to go ahead and change it back to standard for now because I want to keep it in basic photography, you might say. So great way to experiment with black and white photography, or if you need to adjust your JPEGs to have the look and style fit a particular need, you can adjust them in there. All right, the clarity of the image is it's kind of like sharpening. It's just edge detail. It's going to give you a little bit more contrast than sharpening. I'm not sure why they didn't include it in picture style, but it is a new feature and they maybe wanted to highlight it, so they gave it its own spot in the menu. All right, next up is lens aberration correction. And so this is another bit of a rabbit hole. There's a large menu in here for correcting issues with lenses. And we know that Canon makes great lenses, and these RF lenses are some of the best out there, but some of them have issues that are just inherent to optical designs. The first one is peripheral illumination correction. And this is basically vignetting or darkening of the corners. So when you shoot with lenses wide open, they're often going to have a brighter area in the middle and darker area in the corners. And in some cases, you want to correct for that when you're shooting a landscape scene so that your sky has more evenly toned from side to side. Sometimes though, with portrait photography, I'm actually adding in vignettes. In fact, I probably add in more vignettes than I take out. And so I kind of like the vignetting look on some lenses, especially portrait lenses when I'm shooting portraits. And so this is something that you may want to turn on, but I think there's going to be some people that are going to want to turn off. If you do want to clean up the image, then yes, turn it on. And once again, this is only going to be impacted on JPEG images. Distortion correction. All right, so wide-angle lenses are known to have some natural distortion to them. This is a bending of straight lines. And nobody really likes this unless you specifically are putting on a fisheye lens, and then it's wonderful and that's what you want. But generally we want our straight lines to be straight. And so this is something we would generally correct for. Once again, corrects it on JPEG images, does not correct it in RAW images. Digital lens optimizer in here. This corrects for lenses with optical imperfections. And all lenses are imperfect. They try to make them as good as they can, but they are imperfect in some ways. And so this could be a little bit of diffraction. It can be a loss of clarity due to the low pass filter. It could be just anything that the manufacturers know about in the lens and can do a correction for. Now, the tests that I've done have varied a little bit over the years with this feature with Canon. In past cases, it seems to have done a little bit more of an impact, and maybe it's that the new RF lenses are higher quality. I'm not seeing much of a difference in optimization. You're probably better turning it on than turning it off, but it's going to be a very subtle difference in the sharpness of your image. Chromatic aberration correction. So when you are shooting a situation that has strong backlight, so light behind a solid object, you're going to get this color ghosting. That's what the chromatic aberration is. And so far I haven't found anybody who likes this. Nobody likes chromatic aberration. And so this is something you probably want to turn on. It fixes it on the JPEGs, not on the RAWs. It's something that you can fix in a lot of post-production programs without too much hassle. Diffraction correction deals when you shoot with lenses with a very small aperture like f/16, 22, 32, and for instance, there is a loss of sharpness. Now, Canon knows how much their lenses are losing in sharpness, and they can kind of add it back digitally. So if we shoot an example at f/22, we enlarge it, we look at the detail. If we turn it on, yes, indeed, we are getting a subtle little increase in sharpness. We're able to see a little bit more detail between those rocks and the ground. And so this is something that is a downside of shooting at f/22, and this will help solve that problem, at least with JPEG images. So a lot of exceptions because all of this is dealing with JPEG shooting only. And even though I mostly shoot RAW, I still want to get things set up correctly in the camera, and I would encourage you to do the same. All right, on to page 4, long exposure noise reduction. So if you were to shoot a 30-second exposure, it would take 30 seconds, obviously. Now, if you have this noise reduction turned on, the camera is going to shoot a dark exposure, and it's going to process that image for another 30 seconds while you stand around twiddling your thumbs waiting for your camera to do its job. Now the question is it worth turning this thing on? Well, I keep doing tests on this, hoping to see a difference. And so I'm shooting a 30-second exposure, which is long as you can with the standard timer on the camera. And I turn this feature on and off, and I'm not seeing any improvement. Now, maybe there is under some certain particular settings where you're shooting long exposures, but I haven't seen it, and so this is just not worth your while. It also isn't doing you any good if you're in RAW. So for 2 good reasons, I think we can turn this one off. Next up is high ISO noise reduction. Now, this is completely different, but it is still noise reduction. And this is where you definitely get noise problems when shooting at higher ISOs. Once again, JPEG only effect here. Let's take a look at some test results. I shot this at 12,800. I first shot it with the feature turned off. I then turned it to low, standard, and high. And yes, indeed, it does reduce the noise. However, when you are reducing the noise, you're kind of also blurring the image a little bit in order to reduce the noise. So there is a bit of a balance. On one side, you get a lot of noise. On another side, you start getting a loss of detail on the image. And you don't really want to go too high on either one, so maybe standard is the better option. Now there is one more option called multi-shot, and that's where the camera will shoot multiple images in order to get clean data. It combines them and reduces the data. And I usually have a really good imagination for how different people might use the camera, but I'm not sure under what situation you would be on a tripod and you could shoot multiple shots, but you couldn't shoot at a slower shutter speed. There's something out there and I just haven't figured it out. My point is if you need to shoot multi-shot noise reduction, you should probably just lower the ISO and shoot with a longer shutter speed. After all, you're not going to be able to shoot multi-shot on anything that moves because the camera shoots multiple images and then combines them into one frame, so that's going to look odd unless you're being creative. I guess that's an option. So in any case, for your JPEG images, maybe you leave this on standard or off, because if you leave it off, you can actually fix it in post-production software. If you're willing to take the time, you can do it there to a much better extent than the camera can do inside. All right, dust delete data. This is an interesting theoretical feature that not a lot of people use, but it's kind of nice to keep in your back pocket just in case. So dust on the sensor is a major problem. It'll show up on images as black spots. This would be a worst case scenario, you might say. So if you're out in the field and you realize you got dust on your sensor and you do not have the tools or the wherewithal to get the dust off while you're shooting out there, the idea is that you photograph a white sheet of paper so that the camera has a clean map of where all the dust is, and then the camera's software that you use at home will map out all the dust specks. And so this is going to require Canon software in order to do it, and you won't see the fix until you're after at home and process the images through the Canon software. So you do have to go through the Canon software in order to make this work, and it's not something I hope you ever need to use, but just be aware it's a way to potentially save the day when you're out in the field. Okay, on to page 5 of the shooting menu. Multiple exposures. We talked about this before. This is where you can shoot multiple exposures and have the camera combine it into a composite. And so in here is where you get to have finer control of everything. Normally this is going to be left on disable, obviously. Now we do have two on settings, function control and control shooting. The function control option is a little bit more slower and deliberate shooting. You're going to shoot an image, you're going to take a look at it, you're going to go to the next image, you're going to shoot that, the camera's going to combine them. You get to review your images and see what you're doing as you go along the way. If you're doing something a little bit different, that's for sure, shooting multiple exposures in a very fast way, you want to shoot 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2 really quickly, then you can set it into control shooting. And unfortunately, when you do that, you're not going to be able to save the original images. And so there's no menu access, there's no image review between that. It's just quickly going from shot to shot. Chances are you're going to want on function control when you do use this feature. All right, we talked about this before. This is where the camera combines the multiple images and it has 4 different systems. The additive is the full manual option. Average is where the camera just drops the brightness of each image by a stop. Brightness prioritizes bright objects against dark backgrounds, and dark is exactly the reverse. You may need to do some experimentation to see what works best for your scenario. But there's a lot of fun and interesting things that you can do with this feature, so a good area for some exploration and some creativity. All right, next up is the number of exposures. Usually that's 2, but obviously you can shoot more than that for more creativity. Now, do you want to save the original images? Yes, you do. Yes, you do want to save the original images. That way, in case something goes wrong, you don't like the way the camera combined them, you can go back to those original images and work with them to create what you really intended to make. Only put results only here if you are really sure that you're just goofing around and don't want to use up memory space. All right. The multiple exposure mode is something that you're either doing once or you're doing kind of continually for lots of shots. And so if you're just doing it on a one-time basis, one shot only, you set up the multiple exposures, you shoot it, and then it kicks you out of the mode. For those of you who are doing a project where you're using this over and over again, you can leave this in continuous. That way you don't have to come back in here and keep turning it on repeatedly over and over again. Okay, next up is the HDR mode. So the camera can shoot HDR on its own. So let's dive into that little sub-menu here. We are now in a JPEG only mode, all right? So this is where the camera will shoot through 3 photos, either 1, 2, or 3 stops apart, or it will figure it out however much it thinks it needs. It will then combine it into an image. And the idea is to rescue information that is lost in the shadows and to make sure that highlight areas are not getting blown out. I'm not a huge fan of HDR to start with, but this is not the best implementation at all of it. It is an easy way. You can experiment with it. You can see if it works for what you do. Most people who are doing HDR are shooting a standard bracket series of 3, 5, or more frames and using dedicated software where they will have a lot of control over the final image. Here, it's very limited control over what you can actually get done out of the image. Now, there are some special art effect modes in here, and this will blend the images in unique ways. Perhaps these fit one of the styles that you're happy with, but once again, you're very limited with these. There's not a lot of options and tweaks and adjustments you can make to increase or decrease the various factors that go into these blend modes. Continuous HDR, once again, is this a mode that you want to shoot once, or is this a mode that you're shooting a lot of and you want to stay locked into this particular mode? So if you just want to experiment with it, it's one shot only. If you're doing a big project and everything's HDR, then you set it to every shot. The Auto Image Align allows you to shoot HDR images handheld, which is how you're not supposed to do it. But what this does is it crops in on the frame ever so slightly. That way, if you move a little bit from side to side, from one shot to the next, it can combine those. So generally, if you're doing a little bit more serious HDR work and you are using the HDR settings in the camera, you would set this to disable and you would use a tripod. If you're using handheld, set it to enable. Do you want to save the source images? Generally, yes. That way you can go back and use external software if need be. So I highly recommend saving those external images. So focus bracketing is a topic that we covered back in the focus section, but this is where we get in to set all those parameters in here. So focus bracketing is a very helpful technique when you're not able to get everything in focus because you just don't have enough depth of field. The camera will adjust focus from shot to shot to shot so that you shoot a collection of images that are then processed in some post-production software to create a final image that has more depth of field than you could possibly achieve in a single shot. So when you dive in here, the first thing that you can do is turn it on. Normally this is kept off, but when you do want to access it, you would hit enable here. Next up is the number of shots. It's hard for me to give you a specific number, but in general, you want to try to shoot with as few shots as is necessary to get the job done. That way you don't have any excessive images to process in the post-production aspect of this. And so a lot of times I'm shooting smaller products that just need more depth of field than f/16 or f/22 will give, and I'm shooting 10 images. And sometimes it just doesn't work out and I got to shoot 14 images or 16 images. But I'm always trying to keep that number as low as possible. Then there is the focus increment, and this is going to work with the number of shots. You could shoot in a very small increment, but in more shots, or vice versa. And it's going to require some experimentation depending on the lens, the subject, your angle of view, your composition, as to how you're set up. And so these number of shots, focus increment, and your aperture are going to have a big play on where they need to be set in order to get the right overlap from one image to the next. If you're working with a macro lenses can adjust brightness quite a bit when you focus them all the way close up. And so if you are working with a lens at very close up range, you might need to employ this exposure smoothing, which is going to make the exposures a little bit more even. It's going to adjust the exposures so that they have the same brightness between them. Generally, for most focus bracketing, you're not going to need to use this, but with those macro lenses, you might need to give that one a try. Now, when you're done with shooting all of these, you're going to get a little symbol. It's a little folder with a plus sign on the back of the camera, and that's going to allow you, by touching that, to create a folder for those images to go into. And the reason that this is done is because a lot of times when you are shooting this focus bracketing, you're going to end up with a lot of images that are like all the same, and they kind of clutter up your rest of the collection of images. So you can kind of create them all stacked up together and just set them off to the side, and you'll be able to access them on the memory card very easily. It just kind of sets them apart from the rest of your images. Moving on to page 6, the interval timer. This one's a lot of fun, something you can be very creative with. Once again, we're shooting a lot of pictures, a series of pictures, and this time they're separated by time, and we're going to compress time into a short video. And so the idea is you take these images and you use a video program to compress all the still images into a video at 24, 30 frames a second, or whatever you want. So if you do want to get in here, you would first enable this particular feature and then hit the info for detail settings. This is where you get to choose the interval between the images, and that could be anywhere from 1 second to an hour, but generally speaking, for a lot of clouds, people, cars, things moving like that, you're going to be somewhere in the 2 to 3 seconds to 60-second range. And then you get to choose the number of shots, and you can choose anywhere from 1 to 99 or unlimited. So in this case, a lot of times I recommend just setting it to unlimited, looking at the clock, figuring out how long you want to shoot for, and then come back to the camera to turn it off and end the interval timing. If you have your camera set to the bulb mode, you can then enter the bulb timer here and come down to the info detail set, and you can set a specific time. So if you want the camera to be set for 1.5 minutes, you can come down and set it for 1.5 minutes or an hour or however long you want. I will give you a warning that most sensors, and while I have not tested the extent on this one, most sensors don't do well staying open for longer than 15 minutes. There's some exceptions. You can see how this one does. But generally, a lot of these bulb exposures are done in the, say, 2 to 10 minute range, depending on what you're shooting, of course. Be aware, though, that you do have to be in the bulb mode for this feature to really work. All right, the shutter mode. This is one that we talked about before. The camera is, by default, in the electronic first shutter curtain. You can use a traditional standard mechanical shutter, which is good for a lot of things. It may have a little bit of shutter vibration under some circumstances with macro lenses, telephoto lenses, high magnification photography. The electronic first shutter starts the exposure, and then the mechanical shutter stops the exposure. This is going to be good for a lot of types of things. This is going to give you 1/250th of a second flash synchronization, which is the fastest you can get with the camera with a TTL system. The electronic shutter is a clever trick of the camera that you may want to employ in some situations. It's silent, it's incredibly quick, but we do have a lot of distortions that we talked about earlier on in the drive section of the class. It's also limited in the length of time that it can stay open, and you cannot use flash with it. So there's a lot of limitations with the electronic shutter. I would keep that as a nice little trick in your back pocket for certain situations. All right, release without the shutter card. This is kind of designed for people who are selling their camera and they just want to prove that the shutter works in the camera. They don't really want to take photos and save them to the memory card. This would be a good safety thing to set this off, which means that the camera will not be able to shoot photos unless you have a memory card in the camera. So that's a good safety precaution to put for all of us people who do own the camera and want to make sure that when we do take a picture, it is getting saved to a memory card. On to page 7 in the menu, we have an image stabilization mode. And so this may not even show up on your camera. It depends on what lens you have. And so if you have a lens that does not have image stabilization, this is where you would come into the menu to turn that feature on and off. Normally on most cameras, what you're going to do is you're going to just turn that stabilization mode on and off with the switch on the lens. And so if you want to turn it off, and the reason for turning it off is if you are on a tripod and your camera is totally rock solid steady, you don't want the camera or the lens trying to stabilize something that's already steady, so you could leave it off. But normally for handheld photography, you can leave it on, and it's going to give you the ability of holding that camera steadier with slower shutter speeds. And it's a great feature and does an amazingly good job. And so in here, we'll have some different options. We can turn the feature on and off. Once again, if you have the correct lens on here that doesn't have stabilization, you could turn it on here. You can also have it activated all the time when you're looking through the viewfinder or only for the shot. There are some cases where you are panning with action that it's a little disorientating having the camera try to correct for your movements, and some people don't like that, so there is the ability to turn it off. Now with certain lenses, most people are not going to see this, you'll have the option of adding the focal length of the lens on there. And so if you have a lens that doesn't have stabilization and is not being read by the camera for some reason, the electronics, or it's a lens that doesn't have electronics in there at all, then you can tell the camera what lens is on the camera, and that way it's going to give you a stabilization that is optimized for that focal length. And so I highly recommend that if you are wanting to use the stabilization with an uncommunicative lens that has not been able to get read by the camera. All right, the touch shutter on the back of the camera enables us to touch the screen on the camera to activate the shutter. This is something that can also be turned on and off on the back screen of the camera. And it depends on what you're doing. Most of the time it's probably left to turn off because your nose might hit it and trigger shooting it when you're looking through the camera, or if you're just touching using the touch screen for other reasons, probably want to know when you have this turned on. The image review, well, this is a interesting option in here. So this is what we've had on our cameras for many, many years with digital. You take a photo, you look at it on the back of the camera and go, wow, I just took a photo and there it is in front of me. And now you can see it. And so when you're learning photography, it's kind of nice to have that immediate feedback to see exactly what it is you just captured. But for the more advanced photographers, it's not really totally necessary. And if you're concentrating on the moment and the moment to come, I would recommend turning this off. Mirrorless cameras give you a great preview of what your image is going to look like with the white balance and the exposure. You get to see what a digital version of what your camera is pointed at. And so if you turn this off, your camera will just save the image and go to the viewfinder so you can frame up your next shot. And especially in sports and action situations, event photography where you're going from one shot to the next relatively quickly, if you feel confident about the way the camera's working, you don't need to review every shot. So this is just a way to speed up your photography. So at first, yeah, you might want a little review, like a 2-second review, but I think once you get working with these cameras, just turn it off and concentrate on the moment to come. The viewfinder review will tell you where that image is going to be replayed. So normally we've had images reviewed on the LCD of the back of the camera. So you take a photo held up to your eye, you hold it away, you look at it with both eyes, and that's a little bit more comfortable in some cases looking at with both eyes. But there are a lot of cases where it's kind of nice just to have the camera held up to your eye, you shoot a photo, and it plays back right in the viewfinder. That way you're not going back and forth, one eye, two eyes, one eye, two eyes, back and forth, looking at the image and then in the viewfinder again. If you have it in the viewfinder, it's also a little bit more private. You can just see it in there. Nobody knows that you're looking at the last image, and you can check it, see if it's right, and then go on to the next image. And so if you do want to review your image, it's a way of being able to do it a little bit more discreetly. All right, high-speed display. So this makes the display a little bit more responsive. There's no blackout between the shots. If you are doing action photography where you're panning and you're really trying to get a lot of shots and trying to track the action, this is where something you might want to turn on. For general photography, you could probably leave it turned off. I think it probably uses a bit more battery power, so that's a bit of the compromise of this particular setting. Now, in order for this to work properly, there's a whole bunch of things that need to be in place. You need to be in servo, you need to be in the high-speed motor drive. There might be some flicker at high speeds. And so you see that there are limitations to where this is really going to be in effect. Normally, for most people, you're going to leave it off. For sports and action photographers, I think you might want to try it turned on in a lot of situations. Metering timer is how long does the camera continue metering? How long does it take for it to time out? So when you press down halfway on the shutter release, how long does it take to shut back down? 8 seconds is normal. You can adjust this for convenience or for battery life. Exposure simulation, we've talked about this before. This is very important because this is going to change the way the image looks either in the viewfinder or on the back of the camera. We have an exposure indicator that lets us know whether we're underexposed or overexposed, but we can also look at the screen. So if we're just judging the right exposure, I would leave this on enable. However, if you're working with flashes, the camera can't simulate what the flash is going to look like ahead of time. And so in this case, you want to have optimum brightness so that you can compose your image properly. And you're going to probably have to set up your flashes and lights and exposure a little bit separately using the exposure indicator and not just the screen on the camera. And so a very important setting. For most cases, I think leaving this on enable makes it very easy for us to judge the right exposure. All right, shooting info display. This controls what we see when we press the info button on the back of the camera. There's a large submenu in here, and we can control what we see on the back of the camera through our different screens. And I'd like to show you a few options in here. So let's go ahead and dive into a little demonstration in this case. So we're gonna work our way over to shooting info display. I'm gonna hit the set button in here. And so info settings. And so this controls what happens when we press the info. I think I did mention earlier in this class that this one is not normally checked on. And so if you do want to have the screen just turn off, you could do that as well. Now, as you go through some of these, you'll notice that we get an info edit screen here. So our first one has information on the top and bottom. That's pretty good. This next one has information on the side. And then the next one has the histogram and horizon level. And I kind of like some of that, but I want to choose what's in there. So I'm going to hit the info, and now I can choose what items are in there. So I'm going to uncheck all of these and go back up to the top. Okay, exposure information, yeah, that one's pretty important. The side stuff, no, I don't really need that. I'm not going to do the on-screen controls. I do like the histogram, okay? Sometimes I like this, but I'm just wanting to go with the histogram, okay? I just want exposure information and the histogram. Now notice that histogram. That is a brightness histogram, and it is very large. And so we're going to say, okay, so we're going to back out of this with menu. Now I'm going to just jump ahead for a moment. Down here, we can change our histogram. We can change this to an RGB one. We can change this to a small size. I'm going to come back out. I'm going to go back up to the info settings. And the one that we modified is right here. And you notice it went from a large brightness one to a colored small one. So the preview on this camera, the menu adjusts as you are adjusting it, which is really, well, it's how it should be. But most cameras wouldn't do that. And so now, when I go into my live view and I press info, we got our quick control screen. We've got some information on the top and bottom and then on the sides. And there's the one that I wanted, which was I wanted just the exposure information, top and bottom, and a small little histogram. And that's a great way for judging exposure. So that's how I would modify my camera. But you can see there's a lot of options on how you can tweak it and get it adjusted just right so that as you hit the info buttons, you have just the right screens that you like to use come up. All right, same topic, info button, but now you're talking about the viewfinder up on the top that you look through. There's only 3 options here, but they do have some options that you want to go in there and you can turn those on and off if necessary. All right, next up is the viewfinder vertical display. And so generally I love this. So if you are shooting vertically, it moves the information down along to the bottom. I don't like the fact that it overlays the image, so I could see why you might not like that. This also doesn't work well if you're in the rafters and you're shooting straight down, or if you're lying on your back and you're shooting straight up. The camera has a kind of a hard time figuring out which way's up and which way's not when you're in those situations. And so I think for most people, you leave this one turned on. The grid display. And so if you want to see a grid in the viewfinder for alignment reasons, for composition reasons, this can be very helpful. Once again, not something you normally leave left on, but is something that is very helpful to turn on in certain cases. The histogram display, as I showed you before, actually has a little bit of a sub-menu. We can choose between 2 different types of histogram. We have a brightness histogram, which is all of the data. And then we have the RGB, which can show us the color channels and let us know if there's any clipping in one of the channels in particular. We can also choose the size of the display, and since it's just a shape, and you can tell a shape whether it's small or large pretty easy, I would encourage you to use the small one so that you can see more of the area that you're looking at. All right, focus distance display. And so this is another little submenu in here. And so this is kind of this nice display down at the bottom that shows you where you are focusing in distance from the camera. And this is generally going to be nice and helpful in manual focusing mode, but you have some parameters about when it actually shows up, when you are focusing, when you're in the mode, whether it's always there or not there. Choose what works for you. You can also choose the units, and since photography is metric, I think metric is a good choice. After all, you're using probably a 50mm lens, not a 2-inch lens, right? But adjust as necessary. All right, so that's your shooting info display. So we're on to our last page in the shooting menu. We have display option 1 and 2. 1 is going to give you a larger image size in the viewfinder. 2 might be good if you need to wear glasses or you're wearing sunglasses and you can't see the edge of the frame, you can't get your eye close enough to the viewfinder for some reason. That's the reason that display 2 is there. Display performance, and this is going to be a little bit of a power saving performance issue here. And so if you want to get a faster frame rate, this is going to be good for shooting action and when you're panning with subjects. You are going to get a reduced battery life when you do that because that monitor in there uses up a lot of power in that mode. And so most of the time, power saving, sports and action photography, smooth. All right, there you go, folks. Big section, but a lot of very important things in that shooting menu. Hopefully you have got your camera set up properly and discovered a few items that you're going to return to for some special creative time.